I have been using this word critical assumptions. What do I mean by that? You see, in any box tree innovation, you are making a lot of assumptions. Anytime you don't know the answer to a question, it is an assumption. In the New York Times digital case, if someone asked you, do you know who will be the first customer for New York Times digital? I don't know. That's an assumption. Do you know what that customer will be willing to pay for one web page of content? If you say, I don't know, that's an assumption. Do you know who will advertise on your medium? I don't know. That's an assumption. Do you know what price can you charge for that advertisement? I don't know. That's an assumption. Do you know how much you got to pay to attract a software engineer? I don't know. It's an assumption. Do you know how many software engineers do you need to really scale up your web platform? I don't know. That's an assumption. Actually, in box tree innovation, you typically have 20, 30, 40 assumptions. Particularly if you think in a granular way, you are making a lot of assumptions. Nobody can test 30, 40, 50 assumptions. What I therefore suggest is you test critical assumptions. In my way of thinking, critical assumptions are typically about half a dozen. Now, how do you go from a list of, let us say, 40 assumptions to half a dozen critical assumptions? One way I have found executives are able to reduce the number of assumptions to critical ones is to use this 3x3 matrix. On the x-axis of this matrix, what I ask executives to do is to take, let us say, their 40 assumptions and put them in 3 groups. Out of the 40 assumptions, which ones are showstoppers? That means if the assumption proved to be wrong, the game is over. There is no future in this box tree innovation. How many of your assumptions are showstoppers? Out of the 40 assumptions, how many of them are rethink strategy assumptions? That means the game is not over, but the current strategy is not feasible. But there are other strategies that are possible. And how many of those assumptions are tweak strategy assumptions? So take the 40 assumptions and put them in 3 groups. How many of them are showstoppers? How many of them require you to fundamentally rethink strategy? How many of them you need to just tweak the strategy? Then I say take the same 40 assumptions and rate them on the y-axis. On the y-axis, what you're trying to find is what is your confidence that you know the answer to the assumption. By the way, you don't have to be 100% confident before you scale up a business model. You have to be reasonably confident. One way I ask executives to think about this is, will you be willing to bet 12 months of your salary that you know the answer to this assumption? If someone is willing to bet 12 months of their salary that they know the answer to the assumption, that tells me they are reasonably confident. 12 months of your salary, not someone else's salary. Are you willing to bet only 1 month of your salary that you know the answer to the assumption? Are you willing to bet no salary that you know the answer to the assumption? So take the same 40 assumptions and rate them on y-axis into 3 groups. Are you willing to bet 12 months of your salary you know the answer to the assumption? Or are you willing to bet only 1 month of your salary or no salary? Now, critical assumptions are in that zone where either they are game over assumptions or fundamentally rethink strategy assumptions on which you're only willing to bet 1 month of your salary or no salary. That is the zone of critical assumptions. As I mentioned to you, it can't be more than half a dozen. In fact, if a box tree innovation has 20 critical assumptions, perhaps you don't even want to launch that because the risk is too high. Once you have identified the half a dozen critical assumptions, then it is important for you to prioritize these 6 and identify which is the most critical assumption, which is the second most critical assumption, downward to which is the 6th most critical assumption. The idea here is when you are testing assumptions, you want to test the most critical assumption first. Why? Because if that proved to be wrong, there is no reason to test the rest of the assumptions. Again, to summarize, the whole idea here is to narrow down the number of assumptions to critical assumptions, and those critical assumptions is where you should apply this rule. Spend a little, learn a lot. You must minimize the cost of experiment to convert an assumption, critical assumption, into knowledge. If the cost of experiment is low, then the cost of failure is also low. Then the cost of exit is also low. That is the most important lesson in terms of overcoming the learn challenge.